Okay, so this next video is a little bit different, but very much on topic with where my head is at these days. So I had the opportunity to talk with one of the writers of the latest New York Times bestseller, which is The Formula, which is basically a book about Formula One. And where my head has been at recently is, how do you tell the story of Formula One right from its inception to where it is today and the pivotal moment and changes that it's going through right now? But also, how do you capture the tech aspect of it, the development of the technology over the years, the business side of it, going from an amateur sport to a post-Bernie Ecclestone world to now a post-Liberty Media world? How do you take in the European expansion, but then also the American expansion? How do you bridge the gap between what happens on track and what happens off track in the pop culture landscape, but also in the political landscape, as well as in the business landscape? I.e., how do you bottle it all in and explain it to someone who might not be as familiar with Formula One, and how do you get it interesting? And many people have tried to tell the story of Formula One, and I would say very few have actually successfully done so in a way that the average person and fan could potentially be interested in Formula One. Then came along these guys. So Joshua Robinson and Jonathan Clegg are no stranger to writing about an entire series on entire sport. They actually previously wrote this book called The Club, which I absolutely devoured and loved, and hadn't realized that it was the same people behind this book. You know, a book is good with me when it has so many post-its that I ran out of post-its. This is basically 25, 30 minutes with Joshua talking about how you write a book about Formula One, the access that he got, the help that he got, the stories that came up during his conversations. And he has some phenomenal anecdotes. And there's just so many good nuggets and pieces of information that I don't think anyone else has either ever heard or has ever told. So I highly recommend the book. But in the meantime, please enjoy this conversation between Joshua and myself about the story of Formula One, how you tell the stories, and more specifically, something that's really top of mind, which is there is no right way to be a fan. And this is a unique sport where you can be so many different versions of a fan and still be considered a Formula One fan. I hope you like it. Hi, Joshua. Welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you for taking the time. I want to talk a little bit about, before we dive into the contents of your book, I want to talk a bit about the book and the process of putting a book together. And I think my first question for you, and I've got a pretty good answer for that, I think, now that I've finished reading the book, but who was the book intended for? Who was your audience?
You know, the briefest possible way, everyone.
Yes.
The idea is that there's something in the book for everyone. People who, like us, kind of grew up with F1 and have really sort of been basked in the culture of it for a long time, but also people who have come to it sort of in the modern era, sort of post-Netflix, who maybe, don't know who Damon Hill or even Michael Schumacher was, because those people are out there and coming to F1 in droves. And we're attempting here to kind of fill in that background, but also connect a lot of the dots to explain how F1 got to this moment.
I don't think anyone has written a book about Formula One as good as this yet. And I think it's personal to me also, because I'm just like, no one's covered history, how we got here, technology, the pop culture elements. And I think it's you've tapped into all of those pieces. And I'll ask you a few questions about some of the specific pieces that you brought up. But sounds like you've interviewed a lot of people for this book. How much access did you get? And did you get any pushback on certain accesses that you wish that you could have gotten more of?
I mean, I think we were very lucky on access. We spoke to pretty much everyone on our list who is alive.
Wow.
It's been amazing to interview Colin Chapman or Ayrton Senna, but they're not with us. But we did spend a lot of time with Toto Wolff and Lewis Hamilton and Chris Horner and Stefano Domenicali. We got really everyone we were hoping to get, and dating back as well to someone like Luca di Montezemolo, who kind of revived Ferrari twice. We spoke to him, and he was fantastic.
I bet.
It was one of the joys of writing about F1. Our two previous books were about football, which were one of the joys was that access is much better, and you meet a kind of broad range of people who have different backgrounds. They haven't all been in the F1 tunnel their entire careers the way you are in football from the age of 14 or 12 years old. So you have people who have had previous business lives, people who have PhDs, who are engineers, people who have come through the karting pathway. It's really interesting, and there's an incredible range of kind of geographic and education backgrounds that makes them really interesting to talk to.
I love that you brought both of that up because it's also like the range of personalities is due to
Mhm.
their upbringing and where they come from, but also what they studied. This surprises me because most people will tell you right now how hard it is to get any access to F1. So it really warms my heart that you're just like, well, let's take a step back and compare it to football. We had incredible
Yeah.
access. I also think F1 I think maybe realizes right now that they need to open the doors to help tell or allow people to help them tell their story. But the other piece that surprises me is, and I think we forget, and I'm the first one to forget just how diverse the people are who used to work in F1. I feel
Mhm.
like it might have flipped ever so slightly recently that we feel like everyone who's in F1 right now has just been in motorsports for 2, 3 decades. And I kind of tell people like, no, we need more people in this space who don't have 4, 5 decades of motorsports because you bring so much to the table. So I don't know why, but that brings me deep joy hearing that.
And part of that is also that, a little bit, because F1 is so sophisticated now, you do get very highly trained people and a lot of
Mm,
PhDs. And maybe it has lost a little bit of the tradition of the 60s and 70s, where it was really a lot of people tooling around in garages, still, the tinkerers, the makers, the builders, people like Colin Chapman, who kind of had crazy ideas, sent really insane memos to their design departments, and then they would have to sort through and make it into an idea, for a car that really stuck to the ground.
What was the hardest part of the sport for you to convey or feel like it was hard to convey properly or in its depth and breadth? Was there a certain element of the sport where you were just like, wow, this is going to take some work?
John and I have no shame in saying we're total nerds. So the technology aspects really excite us. Um, but we were very mindful of we're only going to use exactly as much as we need of that stuff. So, we have to explain aerodynamics because F1 is a sport of aerodynamics. You have to explain concepts like grip and how the car sticks to the road. And that's about as far as we wanted to go. Sort of give the reader just enough of that information and place it in this context, not of, this really technological progress, but in the context of this is a sport about ideas and pushing the limits and finding those loopholes in the rules, because the
Yeah.
the entire history of F1 is defined by people who found a gray area, went as far as they could in it. Often it's, whatever they discovered was later outlawed, without getting too deep into double diffusers and things like that. But, just geniuses of design, people like Adrian Newey, people like
Yeah.
Colin Chapman and Ross Braun, those people were always nosing around the rule book, trying to find the right loophole. And that's the context for us that we wanted to use any of the tech aspects in.
The whole chapter with Ross Brown is such a nice reminder of that man saw a sandbox and was like, great, let's have a look at all the limits and see how far
That's
we
it.
can push this, which I absolutely loved. What is there a story that you learned during your discovery and talking with all of these people that you just had no idea about that, or just one that you're just like, wow, this is worth the entirety of the book. Like this is it. I wish, and I'm so glad that you can now have the opportunity to share all the stories because I feel like every time I open the book, every chapter, there's a dozen little nuggets, and you can tell by the amount of just like notes I ran out of post-its like a third through the book. I was like, oh well, I know where this is going. But yeah, is there a story, Joshua, that you just like that you discovered that it just was what made it all worthwhile?
I'll give you two. Um,
Great.
One from sort of further back in history
Okay.
uh, was the early days of Niki Lauda at Ferrari, and meeting Enzo and telling him that his car was, a lemon, effectively. He did not put it as kindly. And it was Enzo's son, Piero, who stood there as the translator, trying to convey to him, like, Mickey, you can't really say that. I have to put this as nicely as possible. And him insisting, no, this is a terrible car. We have to start from scratch. And Enzo said, well, okay, you have a week. If you sit with the designers, if you guys don't make it a second quicker a lap, you're out.
Wow.
That story really delighted me. And then a newsier, more recent one was from the time we spent with Toto talking about Abu Dhabi, which was just the most fun chapter to write. Abu Dhabi 2021. Him
Really?
revealing to us that on the Wednesday before the race, he had almost premonition that something was going to go wrong. So he organized in secret a lunch with Michael Masi to tell him, whatever you do this weekend, please, 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 for the love of God, get it right. And that we know what happened on the Sunday.
You bring up Ferrari, so I've got to ask, you've got Ferrari on the front cover of the book. Why put a Ferrari on the cover?
Most popular team in the world. We're trying to sell books.
Do you think that's still true today?
I think it is. I think it is. But I also come back to something that, has often been said and that Bernie Ecclestone said to us again, which is Formula One is Ferrari and Ferrari is Formula One. The two are inextricable. Ferrari is the only team that has been in every season of F1. And really the only team that I think has F1 so at the heart of its identity.
And its DNA.
Yeah, it doesn't. Ferrari doesn't do traditional print advertising. It's never bought ad space in that way. F1 is its shop window.
Do you think that's still going to be true in 20 years if nothing changes?
Well, it's hard to.
I know it's hard to predict, but I'm just
where F1 goes and where the automotive industry goes over the next 20 years is risky business. But it's I think Ferrari's business plan still revolves around the image created by F1. And it's amazing how quickly it happened in the history of Ferrari, because the first Ferraris didn't roll off the line out of Maranello until 1947, which struck me as quite late. In my mind, Ferraris had just always been around. But they won very quickly in the right places, right as Europe was ready to spend money again. So it became extremely popular with the crowned heads of Europe in the 50s, and very quickly also caught the eye of Hollywood. And so rich Americans were dying to buy European luxury in the form of the prancing horse.
And then Ferrari said, well, let's cut that distribution in half, shall we, and make it even less accessible.
That's the model.
And actually, let's talk a little bit about, obviously we have Sir Lewis Hamilton joining Ferrari next year, which I just think is going to be so iconic. I'm curious, based on all the conversations that you've had and the book that you've written, do you think this is potentially a whole new chapter for Formula One? Just like post growth in America, a Ferrari plus a Lewis Hamilton. Those two names for me are synonymous also with the sport. Like, do you think this is entering a whole new chapter, or do you think this is just another smaller chapter in the whole history of Formula One, or is it like a big marker?
I think it's a culmination.
Okay.
I think the culmination of the modern era in the way that, in a similar way that having a race in Vegas was. This is almost fan service. It's the most popular driver on the most popular team. This is what so many fans want to see, and it just creates, as you said, a whole raft of iconic images. And I think any driver who gets into Formula One will tell you that the dream in the back of their heads the first time they got into a go-kart was
Ferrari,
that little red car. The red car. And here's an interesting tidbit for you that I didn't know until we were researching the book. The red car that, Italian sports cars have to be red in our heads. That all comes from the early days of motor racing, when every country was assigned a color. And I didn't know that until writing the book. But British cars were green, and there's our British racing green. French cars were blue. German cars were white or silver. There are your silver hours from Mercedes. And of course, Italy was assigned.
The only reason I have this date, because I'm terrible with dates in my mind, is because I literally just did a video this morning. But 1968 was the first time that the FIA allowed for sponsors on liveries and sponsors on helmets, taking away from the national colors, which I love, because that ties into like Bernie Ecclestone, who like taped on the side of Johan Rein's helmet for space for sale, and just was like, great, this is how we start the sponsorship. And you kick off the book pretty quickly with like an ode or a nod to Lewis and his fashion in the paddock. Was that intentional? Was that because if you look at the grand scheme of the sports, that doesn't feel like the space that most, or the place that most people would kick off a book about Formula One. But I kind of love that you did, and I was just curious if that was an intentional place to start, or if it just so happened.
Yeah, well, Lewis is, I'm constantly fascinated by Lewis as a character. I've written about him, not just in the book, but previously did magazine covers in the Wall Street Journal. And I've written about him a lot over the years. And I find him so fascinating because he is, one of the greatest of all time in any sport. And him, as a character, he's such a unicorn in Formula One because of his sensibilities outside the sport. He's into fashion. He's into music. He is an A-lister's A-lister. And for a long time, it felt like, at least in America, he was more famous among famous people
Yes.
than he was just walking down the street. You go to Met Gala, and he was the person that people wanted to
Yeah.
take photos with. You go to his garage at like one of the big races,
Swarming.
and it would be swarming. Tom Brady, Serena Williams, people wanted to be near him. And he's such a magnetic character in that way that I think having him right at the beginning, really, still at the peak of his powers, is a natural place for us
I
to
like
start.
You talk about, and God, this is something I've been talking about for a couple of years now, but you talk about in your book F1's search for, quote unquote, the right conditions for it to basically succeed in America. What factors do you think contributed to the growth in America, beyond the simplistic Drive to Survive, F1 growth in America narrative? But what did you come out of that discovery with? Of like, what was the perfect storm? What were those conditions?
Well, I think American ownership certainly came in and realized that this being the United States, was the great untapped market, because F1's misadventures over the years in the States, are numerous, and with a whole chapter.
That chapter is phenomenal. It's fun. I don't think I had realized quite the early beginnings of just Bernie just being like, I am going to make this work. Maybe not. God, they hate me. God, I hate them.
And the tire fiasco, the Michelin tire fiasco, was really just the end of it.
2005, 2006. Yeah.
They had raced in the parking lot at Caesar's Palace in 80 and 81. They had tried Detroit. They tried upstate New York. My favorite anecdote was when they raced in Phoenix, and people were so not interested because it was hot. The seats were like melting in the sun. People were so uninterested in this that F1 was only the second most popular event in the city that weekend. They were outdrawn by an ostrich festival.
Yeah.
So
sure, Bernie was ecstatic about that.
Bernie was quite turned off by the whole thing and basically gave up on America.
So we have Liberty Media, American ownership. What are the other conditions, do you think, just made what has been possible in the last 5 years?
Beyond Netflix specifically, I think what F1 did quite brilliantly was create so many touch points for people to engage with F1. And so in that way, and this is kind of one of the takeaways from the book, is that F1 is kind of a post-sports sport right now, in that you can call yourself an F1 fan and you can be super connected and have strong feelings about Charles Leclerc and Alex Albon and everyone else, and buy the merch and watch Drive to Survive and follow them all on Instagram, and maybe never watch the races, and you will be still an F1 fan in your own right, connected and emotionally engaged in this. And F1, I think, is the only one that does that at that level right now, because you can be like a lifestyle fan, you can be a technology fan. It just has all of these different aspects. And so that's another aspect that kind of has accounted for the success in the United States. And I would say the third thing is something we saw and wrote about in our previous books with the Premier League. And the Premier League did something very clever, which was export this kind of European authenticity, have a big tent, invite everyone else, and make it into almost a status symbol of fandom. You might watch, college football, the most American thing in the world. But for a different kind of person, supporting a Premier League team is a way to indicate, like, oh, I'm open to the rest of the world. I maybe studied abroad. I might subscribe to the New Yorker, and I definitely drink on Saturday mornings. F1, I think, has some of that appeal as well, a bit of that European cachet that goes beyond just being able to talk about Monaco and Ferrari and McLaren and things like that.
I love that you talk about the diverse ways that we can be fans. My favorite anecdote is this. I think it was on a Twitter thread of this guy who's like, I finally got the wife interested in Formula One and I've got Drive to Survive to thank for it, but it backfired because she now refuses to watch the seasons of Formula One to not spoil her the next season of Drive to Survive. And so I'm just like, that is incredible. And also the poor guy is like, I really thought I'd figured it out. I really thought I was going to be able to enjoy races with my wife. And she's like, I'm not spoiling the next season of Drive to Survive. I'm not watching this.
But both of them are F1 fans.
But both F1 fans in their own right. Exactly that.
Both paid up members.
Exactly. What do you think right now Formula One is bringing to America, and what is America offering Formula One? Because you talk a little bit about that in the book, of just like Bernie's struggle of just like Or the Americans also saying F1 is just like this uninvited guest that doesn't wipe its feet when it walks through the door and just like puts all their mud everywhere. And it feels like there's maybe that narrative has shifted, and it feels like maybe there's an equilibrium that's been reached where America feels like F1 is bringing something to the party and vice versa. What do you think those things are?
Definitely, as we discussed, for F1, this is the great untapped market, and this is the opportunity for growth that it hasn't seen since, of the kind it hasn't seen since like the 90s, the last peak of the sport. What I would say America gets from F1 is almost a total newcomer into the sports landscape that bridges that gap between sports and entertainment in a way that, the NBA or the NFL, and certainly not Major League Baseball, has been able to do. And so you get these events like Las Vegas, like Miami, and like Austin, 3 kind of different flavors of F1, but that create entire mini Super Bowls and provide so much a kind of different image related to sports that people are not used to seeing here. So as I said, you get the glitz of like a Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen and all those guys coming in, taking over a city like Las Vegas, making it their very own soundstage, like a movie set. And it becomes this major event that everyone talks about for about 72 hours. Then it goes away, and we'll see you next year. But it is a mega event, and that is unlike anything America already has. And if it's shiny and it's loud, America's going to love it.
Actually, pulling on that thread a little further, I really loved your epilogue where you talk about David Hill and how F1 worked with him to design, quote unquote, a race for TV. And I love that because I'm about to attend the Indy Thermal Club race, which they've also described as a race for TV. And it seems like we're having more and more sporting events, and Netflix has done this with the Netflix Cup. What do you think that says about the sporting industry and the sporting/entertainment industry as a whole? This idea of doing these events for TV, and like in your epilogue, you explain the harshness of trying to make a for TV event when it's just like they're racing in a cage. This is really ugly. What do you think that tells us about the state of entertainment and sports right now, that we have to look at it from that lens?
It is the central question in sports today. Who are you servicing? Are you there for the 400,000 people who might come to a Grand Prix over the course of a weekend? Or are you servicing the potential audience of billions out in the world and trying to give them a compelling TV product that will, get them to subscribe to something or watch advertising or anything like that? And that fine line is very difficult to toe, because football clubs are having the same question, or are facing the same question. 50,000 season ticket holders, but broadcast in nearly 200 countries. How do you manage the expectation and the engagement of people who might never ever come to the stage?
Do you think it's possible to service both fans at the same level, so both types of fans at the same level at the same time?
I think it is, and I think the Premier League does it very well by kind of flooding the zone. I think F1 is doing it in a much more interesting way, and doing things that getting people to engage in ways that have nothing to do with the in-person experience. And Netflix is one of those examples, but the things they do on social media and push in quite a sophisticated way, and really broad way across the spectrum. So each team has its own kind of social identity. They built up the personalities of the drivers in a really clever way, and that's something that David Hill, who is the TV guru that Liberty brought in 2017, realized immediately. He said, this club of 20 drivers, there's only 20 in the world. There are fewer people in the world who can call themselves professional F1 drivers than there are New York Yankees. When you think about how iconic that is, and these men to him are gladiators, and we need to see their faces, because they do these heroic things, but you never see their faces. They're inside these helmets, inside the balaclavas. So as soon as they were out of the car, he was instructing them, get your helmet off. We need to see your beautiful faces.
Interesting. Yeah, the epilogue is I think I read it 2 or 3 times because I knew very little about that, and I was like, this is a genius way to close out the book. I really enjoyed it. What do you think other sports can learn or take away from the recent success of Formula One and everything that they've done? And what do you think are the things that no one else can replicate, that is just only F1 can replicate because of the nature of the sport and what it's built?
Well, we've seen everyone else try to do a Drive to Survive. with varying degrees of success. The tennis one, personally, I found quite dull. The Tour de France one I thought was great, but I happen to love cycling. Everyone else is trying to create some sort of off event on platform piece of entertainment that can replicate some of that effect and bring in new audiences. The thing they cannot replicate, and certainly I hope we're not able to, is the timing. Season 2 of Drive to Survive, the first one with Ferrari and Mercedes as well, dropped 2 weeks before the big start of the pandemic in at least in Europe and North America, and we all spent a year on the couch.
That has been my deep, deep frustration, and it is the hill that I think I've died on and will die on, of just this simplistic narrative of Drive to Survive created this boom of growth in America is wrong, and anyone that wants to try and replicate it is going to fall flat on their face because you can't replicate it. We had the pandemic, we had the rise of TikTok, which actually drove much of the word of mouth and the conversations about Formula One, and we had the rise of the creator economy, and to your point, all of that. People seem to forget that we had a season of Drive to Survive before season 2 absolutely blew up.
But that first season, something that's interesting about it is because Mercedes and Ferrari weren't in it, it kind of gave more oxygen to the other teams. And that's where you get like McLaren era Daniel Ricciardo suddenly becoming a star.
Yeah.
Everyone got his $1 million smile, and he took his shirt off a lot, and he was really fun and gave them all the access they wanted.
Got to ask you about Andretti being snubbed by Formula One. I love that you brought in the history of obviously Andretti and the Andretti family and the name throughout the book. And I think a lot of people forget that this isn't, the Andretti name is part of Formula One history, and they didn't just wake up one day and decide, oh, F1 is having all of the success, we want a part of that. I'm just curious, any strong feelings, like, do you think they've got a shot at getting back into F1 at some point in the near future?
I mean, I think we know that the teams are broadly against expansion because they know how big the pie is, and the pie is as big as it's ever been right now. But no one wants to slice off an extra piece. And they don't understand why, and I think Toto has been very open about this. The teams that built the current state of F1, especially in the past decade, don't necessarily want to share what they've built and carve off whatever they've, a piece of their finite share for a new team that would crowd the grid, probably not be competitive right away, and somehow get an equal piece of TV money.
You don't think that F1 is missing out on this is the next step of that growth in America? I often worry that we had this whole hype around F1 in America right now for a handful of reasons of which we've talked about, but now they really need to service the fans and service this market and be present. And it feels like having a household name like Andretti would help in that next step. Or do you think it's just like wrong timing right now? Or
I think it could, but as long as the teams are against it, and
it's never going to happen.
What F1 has done brilliantly as well is made the teams understand that ultimately they are all in business together.
Yeah.
This is a little cartel. And so they are desperate to protect this thing of theirs and not dilute it.
Maybe one last question of just like any misconceptions that you think in your world outside of Formula One, in your everyday life, that people may have of Formula One, that you're just like, that's just the wrong way of looking at it, and something maybe that bugs you that you're just like, we definitely made sure in the book to explain this misconception, or just in general, is there any misconceptions about Formula One that you wish people...
I think, in terms of positive misconceptions,
none
of those are actually all that wrong because of the different ways there are to consume F1. Positive misconceptions. Oh, it's just a bunch of pretty boy millionaires, driving in places like Monaco and Singapore. It's like, that's actually not wrong. That's not wrong. It's like they do tons of other stuff, but if that's what you like about it, sure, go crazy. Follow them on Instagram, watch Drive to Survive. Or people being like, the rules are super complicated. The cars are like, I don't understand, tire compounds and things like that. But if you're into it, it's there for you. You don't actually need to be into those things to like F1. I think that's the misconception.
That you need to understand the entirety of the sport to enjoy it. I love it. Joshua, thank you so much. Again, I could talk with you for a handful of hours, but we're going to keep it at this. This is a good solid 30 minutes. But thank you so much. This was great.
Thanks so much for having me.